So thank you all for coming. We've just been here since the end of January, so we're coming up on 6 months being open. And I've been working in this industry overall for over 12 years, but most of my work with people has been more one-on-one consulting and not so much a class setting. So this is a new fun thing for me to try doing. I will say that there's a lot of classes out there that'll talk about edible or medicinal. I wanted to make sure I put in some notes about the ecological angle too, because we've been so ingrained in our culture to just like spray it or pitch it if we don't want it there, and we forget that even outside of our own uses, it might be providing a use to the environment when it's growing, and that's something important to consider too. So even if you go home and you don't want to eat your dandelions, something else might, and you might want to leave it there for that reason. That is all inspired in part by a concept called permaculture. Has anybody in here not heard of permaculture? Raise your hand if you have not heard of permaculture. Permaculture is a regenerative agricultural practice developed by 2 Australian gentlemen in the 1970s. And the whole concept of it, come in, join us. We just started, you're not far behind at all.
I have a friend that's going to. She's excited.
I printed so many booklets we might have to share. Cheat on your partners and take a look. The concept of permaculture, that's a sort of a shortened slang term for permanent agriculture, and it's based on the idea that we should be able to provide for our needs, but by mimicking nature's cycles, we can do it in the least disruptive way possible. So it's kind of like everything has a place on your land site that you're working with. Waste not, want not. Everything you're doing is contributing to the full life cycle, be it in the soil health and microbiota, etc., all the way up through the plant, what you intake, what the wildlife intakes, etc. And so that really lends itself in particular to the consideration of how weeds interact in our landscapes. So we use the term weed and weeds to generally be referring to things that we might consider invasive, so they just take over an area, or maybe they're not so much invasive, but that they are just somewhere where we don't want them to be. But it's actually kind of intriguing that most of what we are predominantly thinking of as weeds nowadays actually had a history of use with our European ancestors. So most of them, and all the ones that we're going to talk about today, are not native to this continent. They were brought here, and they were generally brought here because they were known to have food or fiber or medicinal uses. So it's like we're coming full circle in remembering things that our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents would have been making use of. The advent of, some people are like, oh, well, then if they're so great, why don't we still use them? The advent of grocery stores, being able to import exotic things from elsewhere kind of made some of these things fall out of favor. And then, of course, tastes change. A lot of wild foods are very pungent or very bitter, and if you're not used to consuming those food substances, it has to be a learned taste. And so the less we have experience with it, the less likely we are feeling inclined to make use of it. I will say, though, that weeds are categorized as weeds because they have something in common with one another, and that is that they tend to be very resilient species. So it's like that one little thing. I took a picture one day. There was a dandelion coming up out of the concrete back stairs of this building, like literally, like not even a crack visible to the human eye, and somehow this whole plant was blooming and flowering out of it. And so there's something to be said for the fact of learning these plants, because even if you don't want to eat dandelion greens or what have you on the daily, it might be good to know, because you never know when you could end up in a scenario where that would be very important. The fact that these, we're in a lot of transitional times with the environment and the climate and so forth, and farmers globally are wondering, oh my gosh, what are we going to do for food security? So it's worth considering if there's plants that are usable by us that don't need a lot of babysitting, and they don't need to be sprayed with anything because they don't have things that wipe them out, and yet we can still eat them, then that could be survival food, that could be survival medicine. As a general quick guideline, if you're going to go out foraging, particularly for medicinal use, it's worth noting that if you're wondering, like, well, which part of the plant was, that I wanted to use, and when am I supposed to pick it for that? Think about the life cycle of the plant. The energy of the plant is concentrated in whatever part of the life stage that the plant is in. So if you're doing something, you're making a tincture or something where the root is going to be applicable, you would generally want to harvest your roots, as we come out of winter into spring, and as we go out of fall into winter, because it's the time that the plant is concentrating its energy into the root to grow up or go back down to dormancy. Leafing stage would be like early spring into summer, anytime really prior to flowering, and then obviously flower, and following flower is fruit and seed stage. So depending on what part of the plant you're needing to make what you're making, just it doesn't mean you can't use the other parts necessarily at any given time. It's just when the medicine is going to be strongest, so to speak. The compounds that we know to have the things that we need them to do would be most concentrated at those times. So leading in, we are going to start with the mighty dandelion, because everybody knows that has to be included. I know for the longest time I always just assumed it got its name because of the fluffy yellow head, looks like a dandelion's head, but it actually came from the French dent de lion, which is tooth of the lion. And that is because, I kept them in the fridge overnight and they're still wilty. It's like the lion's teeth. And there are a number, I think it's 200 some species related to dandelion, and a lot of them are on our continent. And a lot of them in the leaf stage can trick you. None of them would necessarily hurt us, but again, you're looking for the right medicine here, so you want to make sure your identification is on point. So I brought some things to trip you up. Easy things to mistake. This one here is chicory, which is usable by us. It didn't make the cut for today's class, but maybe in the future we'll go more into chicory. Not quite as much toothiness, more of a spade shape on the end. And then this is from something that is blooming everywhere right now. This is the biggest ear I've seen for this plant. Common name is cat's ear. And it never really gets a lot bigger than this. So you might think, oh, it's a baby dandelion, but I can pass it around because it's actually kind of fluffy. It almost, they call it cat's ear, but it feels like a cat's tongue. So that's a giveaway with that. And its flowers, dandelions, a marker for them is that they send one single stalk up with one flower head on the end from its base rosette. The cat's ear can send up multiple really long, skinny, twisty stalks. Its flowers don't get as big or as thick and full as dandelion. And when it turns into its sort of poof stage, it's almost like a real fine, feathery hair versus the dandelion, which gets the classic bulb that you just fly away as soon as you look at them. So there's some keys for your dandelion identification. It's, I don't know if I want to say rare, but it is a little bit rare, that it would be an example of a plant that is medicinal, edible, and all parts are usable and safe. So you can use the root, the leaf, the flower. There's applications for all of those things. As a food, it's rich in A, B, C, all your greens are rich in minerals. This one's pretty off the charts with its iron, magnesium, potassium, and calcium content. Our chair is done.
Okay, thank you.
And you are the 10th person.
All right.
Huzzah.
Okay. Do you have any more handouts?
We
wow.
do
We can share.
not,
We
but
can share, we can
yes, to share. And as far as
Okay.
if I don't have enough for take home, I am happy to email you the PDF document to print out your t-shirt. Straight proud of these t-shirts.
Yeah, this
Nice
is
little
beautiful.
So in addition to your vitamin and mineral content, you're looking at inulin. Most roots contain inulin, which is a fiber. Not in as much the sense of like you think of as a regulatory fiber for digestion, but it's used commonly nowadays in supplement formulas as a prebiotic fiber, which essentially that means food for your probiotics. So it's not just enough to be taking in all the good bacteria. They need to set up shop, they need to live in there, and they need the right environment to do so. So now you're finding probiotic supplements will be amplified with the prebiotic included to guarantee that those little bacteria go in there and set up shop. I will say it's almost more marketing than anything else. Oh, I need a prebiotic. Eat things that contain fiber and you're good. Chicory, dandelion, most of those tap-rooted wild weeds are a rich source of inulin. And the root has also been historically roasted and ground up and used as a caffeine-free coffee substitute. I imagine that mostly originally came about because it was in a time when people couldn't afford or import coffee where they lived. And now it's just kind of more of like, oh, I'm trying to get off of coffee, and this is a nice earthy tasting roasted beverage alternative. So it's kind of chic now. Medicinal properties, detoxification, particularly with liver, kidney, and blood. You'll see it in almost any given liver formula. You'll sometimes see it in kidney formulas. It has some diuretic effect for balancing the fluid levels in the body. But it's also usually the backbone in bitters formulas, so it's really, really good for digestive conditions and concerns. And bitters are kind of making a comeback more so on the medicinal scene lately. For a while there, our culture was mostly thinking of them as something to flavor alcoholic drinks with, but all of those formulas originally started as medical tonics. And what happens when that bitter taste touches your tongue is not only is it stimulating the salivary glands, and so these enzymes that your body produces are coming out to help break the foods down, it's also stimulating a gastric response and bile coming out from the liver to like stimulate the body to be like, okay, I'm getting ready to eat something here, I need to break this down, and it's like priming the system. So bitters formulas are usually in like a tincture dropper or a spray, and you want that to touch your tongue, and you could do it, 20 minutes or so before a meal to kind of get ready to ingest your food. And it's actually classically why it came about that in eating meals and courses, why a salad course comes first, because you're going to eat the bitter greens first to get your body ready to then receive the heavier later meals to come. Ecologically, I had a woman here the other day that was like, yeah, I'll leave the dandelions alone except for when they're with my tomatoes. It is a tap-rooted plant, so it sends one primary root down, and it doesn't really do this much. So it's not going to hurt or invade your tomatoes. You can leave it there. I've worked on and off with an agricultural extension agent in the area just with consulting, and he was telling me about how one year he was so excited because he was growing all these medicinals, so he planted a bed of dandelion, and he regrets ever having done that because it doesn't need your encouragement. You don't have to get rid of what's there, but just let it do its thing, because even though it's not invasive, it's prolific, and you don't necessarily want it to get to a point where like, well, I was going to plant blah 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 there, and now I can't because it's full of dandelion, and I feel guilty ripping up the dandelion. So just let it do its thing. As far as other ecological benefits, it's not a primary food source for bees, but most flowers have an affinity for pollinator species, and that's always important. And it is one of the first flowers, at least in our region. I'm sure you've seen this news buzzing around the internet about how, because it's one of the first flowers to bloom in the springtime, it is while it's not necessarily the bees' primo nectar food choice, it's an important food choice because it's one of the first things available when the bees come out of their winter dormancy, and they need to resupply their energy, and so they're going to look for whatever they can find. And especially here in the mountains, we get those cold snaps sometimes sneak up in May, and it can decimate a bee colony if they weren't amply ready and prepared the previous winter to get through. And all the more reason why on those warm days, and they send out their first foragers in the spring, that you want to leave those dandelions alone and don't spray them with things and let the bees get to it first. You can let the bees have it. Dandelion flowers are almost everlasting. I mean, it'll bloom and it'll sit there for weeks before it starts to turn into the little puffball stage. So you can give the bees a little chance to get what they need from it before you take it and use it for yourself. All of that being said, it's one of the safest things you could use, but because of its diuretic properties, if you're dealing with a kidney issue, or you're already taking a fluid pill or something like that, you want to be careful. And anything that has the potential to make you flush more has the potential to be lowering your electrolytes too. So if you're doing anything that is going to be, maybe you're doing it intentionally, you're trying to cleanse, you're trying to, like, you've got swelling from excess fluid, you want to flush that out, just be mindful of your mineral content, and you can do that by eating the greens. So you're getting the minerals replenished, as opposed to a tea. You might drink dandelion tea, it'd be diuretic, but if you eat the greens, you'll get the happy balance of the diuretic with the minerals replenishing. It is in the family of plants that contain ragweed. At this point, I don't know what plants in this country aren't related to ragweed. It seems like they all are. So if you have seasonal ragweed allergies, you'd be more careful with this plant, particularly where the flower is concerned. You might be doing fine with the root or the greens, and maybe just steer clear of the flower just to not stir up your allergies. Moving on to mugwort. I have a special gift for everybody, but this is also related to ragweed. So if anybody has ragweed allergies, I will not do a demonstration, but if anybody is interested, I'm happy to light one of these smudge sticks on fire so you can smell what it smells like.
I'm allergic to ragweed, but I don't have a problem with
mugwort?
mugwort.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
That's always the case too. I mean, there's a spectrum,
Yeah.
So you might be sensitive.
And I'm only allergic to ragweed when it blooms, which is like late August to mid-October.
So this grows at the moment prolifically on my property, and I spent all day yesterday pulling all of these smudge sticks up. It's a different smell than sage, but it is similar. It's not as dense as sage, so it doesn't smolder the same way. And this isn't one. This is one I had from last year. Those are all fresh for you guys. Kind of like a campfire smell. Most people use white sage for like cleansing, and they actually have found that there's constituents in the plant that actually literally cleanse bacteria out of the air. I'm sure this probably has a similar effect to that, but mugwort's more shamanic sort of uses as such relate more to dreams. It's said to enhance your dreams or help you sleep better. People would put it in their pillowcase, hang it over their bed, burn it, drink it as a tea. I've attempted the tea and the pillowcase method. I'm not sure. I would say the pillowcase method might have done something, the tea not so much. But I have vivid dreams anyway, so don't take my word for it.
Well, I don't ever remember them, and the few times when I've lit that, I'm not saying every time, I don't remember, my memory sucks, but there's been several times where I actually remember my dreams after smudging with them. Which is amazing. I
Burn
never remember my
seems to be
dreams
the best too,
ever.
really.
Pretty magical.
Hmm?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
they
for
said
smoke blend.
herb
And
blend.
it intensifies it more.
You hide it?
Like euphoric, but not high.
It's actually better for you than tobacco.
Yes.
So it's,
Yes. There's a lot of
Really?
different things you can smoke.
It's the same board. This is fresh, so, well, fresh as in I picked it
I
last
love
night.
the smell of
You
it.
rub the leaf through it. It almost has like a myrrh kind of smell. It's very resinous. When you first pick it, it's almost sticky. It's dried down now. Its leaves are actually similar looking to ragweed. I say that because it comes up misidentified as ragweed a lot. But once you're familiar with it and you know the plant, you will never mistake it for ragweed again. For one, I mean, the smell alone gives it away. There's nothing else that smells like that, in its fresh, raw state especially. In general, once you see its growing habits, it's very different than ragweed. It tends to grow in very thick stands. I mean, what starts small will, in a season, take over. This you could classify as invasive, so again, I wouldn't encourage you to be like, spread everywhere, mugwort. Or if you do that, do it like on the back of your property. Yes, ma'am.
Is mugwort native to North America or is it a European?
It's a European transplant. I'm sorry, where was I? Mugwort, don't spread it. So a little tiny piece of the root, this is speaking from experience here, can start to grow a rather vigorous plant in a matter of weeks.
Wow.
So I moved onto my property and there was a stand of mugwort and I was like, oh, this is so great, I'm gonna leave a little patch and garden all around it. And then the next year the patch kind of spread a little bit and I'm like, oh, that's okay. And then the next year I was like, it's creeping into the path. So I'm just gonna till up the path and mulch over it to smother the weeds out. I tilled it under, because most things you can till under. This is permaculture. You don't have to clear everything out and make your garden beautiful. Just put it back into the soil. That is green manure. That is active compost right there. For everything except for mugwort. Okay, just don't do it for mugwort. Because now my garden is more than half mugwort in it. And I had a T-section pathway that was easily like this wide. And my garden's 70 by 80, and it is just like the mugwort's this tall in a cross shape taking over the garden in one season. And you have to dig that out by hand, and you have to do it carefully because you touch it and it breaks its root. It's like, ah. And then the tiny little piece that fell off is now turning into a plant that can grow 3 to 5 feet tall on average in very dense clusters, and it forms like a mat just under it doesn't go deep, it's just along the surface of the soil, but it creates a very dense mat, yes. But ecologically, ladybugs love it. I can walk through that stand and it's ladybug, 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 ladybug. And ladybugs are important for your garden because they are the natural predators of aphids, and aphids will suck the life out of your vegetable plants, so having some ladybugs around kind of keeps the ecological balance going. So mugwort typically likes to grow in wooded edge area, so if you are going to want it around for the benefit of the ladybugs, maybe have it as edge habitat near your garden, but give it at least a 15-foot berth to start. So you can stay on top of it and keep it from creeping into where you didn't intend for it to be. Food properties, it's still to this day quite popularly used in Asian countries, Japan primarily, although there's some thought that a lot of the food use originated in China. One of the recipes I included is a Japanese sweet treat using mugwort, and they'll use it as a coloring agent. It makes such a bright, rich green color in a lot of foods. They would also cook it down as a pot herb, so just like you would saute spinach or something. A lot of the very pungent, sort of resinous smell to it goes away when it's cooked, when it's steeped. It's really just only in the fresh plant. So if you smell that and you're like, I don't know if I want to eat that. It doesn't come through the same way when you cook it down, although I will say it has a more distinct and rich taste compared to spinach. There's a gentleman who worked for National Geographic named Dan Boutner who wrote a book called The Blue Zones, which is a study he organized across multiple countries, looking at the areas of the world that had the longest lived people in their total population, so people averaging into their hundreds. And when he studied a group of people on the island of Okinawa in Japan, one of the common denominators in all of their food was that they cooked and ate a lot of mugwort. So he included that in his book as a, maybe there's something to mugwort consumption and longevity. Robust grower. If you're not used to consuming it, large quantities of it have been known to upset people's stomachs. So don't just get all excited and then eat it every day and drink tea, etc., like pace yourself. It has a property which is known as an emmenagogue. That's a herbal term for something that is stimulating or regulating blood flow. So if you're on blood thinners medically, then it might be contraindicated to use that plant. If you're pregnant, just for safety concerns, don't use the plant. But conversely, it does come up in women's health formulas as a balancer to monthly cycle. It's also known for some of its properties in dealing with bacterias and parasites. I have known people have used it in topical application, but I wouldn't say that's quite as common. It is more often found in like teas and tinctures and things like that. Nextly, we're gonna move on to nettle. And I find most herbalists like to just call it nettle, because to say sting nettle is just like off-putting, but it comes by its name, honestly. I will not pass this one around. If you want to harvest this, use gloves. It is covered in teeny, tiny hairs, as you can see. It's on the stalk, it's on the leaves, it's on the top, it's on the bottom. It goes from the tip of the plant down to the stalk.
Pretty serious.
And those little tiny hairs, which are soft, they're not like barbed, they won't trap you like a thorn bush would. But they excrete formic acid, which is extremely irritating to the skin. In fact, a lot of animals and insects will avoid this plant, and it's supposedly, if certain animals, I would imagine smaller animals like birds and rodents, got really caught up in this, it could potentially even kill them because they would just get overloaded with the output from the stingers. But I think most animals are smart enough to learn to avoid it, and humans, maybe we're not that smart, but it's actually a good thing and to our benefit. This is nature's multivitamin. Moringa is a plant that's really trendy right now as a superfood, and you can get it as powder and put it in your smoothies and it tastes great, but it's tropical and native over to India. This is our moringa. All the things people want to get moringa for, just reduce the 29 times the calcium of spinach, 9 times the iron of spinach, just to call out a few things. It's got essential fatty acids, it's got amino acids. This is actually a protein source. People are vegetarians. Where do you get your protein? Eat greens. That's why gorillas are so big, right? They eat mostly greens. There's one instance where you might actually want to touch the plant. If you have arthritis, this is like the old farmer and gardener's little remedy. Oh, my hands are aching. I guess I'll go harvest the nettle now. Because what happens when you get the topical reaction is, at first it might sting or itch a little, and the area will become red. And to somebody who doesn't have any ongoing chronic inflammation or pain, that becomes the inflammation and somewhat pain, and you're just like, oh gosh. But if you're already swollen and inflamed, those chemical compounds actually have a balancing effect and tamp that inflammation response down. And I actually watched Rick Scalzo, who's the founder of Gaia Herbs down in
I
Brevard.
saw him do it.
Yeah, he'd
Vlogging.
just take a whole bushel, have somebody from the group volunteer, like, oh, my knee hurts, and then he'd be like, and then their whole knee turned red, and then they're like, okay, yeah. And the more you are used to working with the plant too, you do get to a point where you might not be as sensitive. And I mean, I can.
Touch-me-nots help it.
Huh?
Touch-me-nots, which are grown beside it in the creek. Touch-me-not, rub it, takes it all away.
They must have like an oil content to it or something.
The leaves, the stem, anything on the touch-me-not.
And we will be talking about another plant that can be a useful counteracting remedy as well. We'll get to that one here shortly.
What, I have a question about nettles. I think I've used it as teas and tinctures, but I know some people like say that if you cook it, like if you're doing a green saute thing, that takes away the sting, you can eat it.
Yes, if it's dried or if it's cooked, basically if it's processed at all in anything other than this state, that formic acid and all that goes, and the little hairs fall off. It's not, you wouldn't eat it and feel like there's fuzz in your mouth or anything like that. So the reason that we can use it and other wildlife doesn't so much is mainly just that we have ways of post-processing to make it usable. I will say though, these teeny little inconspicuous flowers are, from the ecological standpoint, an important food source for butterflies. So there's another pollinator plant for you too, not a real showy one, but nettle isn't really invasive, and this actually out of what we're talking about is native here. Nettle is native. But it tends to initially when it's growing just kind of creep a little and just be like doo-doo, and then after a few years it can fill an area. It then generally it can tolerate some shade. It generally likes wetter conditions. I have it on the corner of in the area of the edge of my pasture, kind of underneath some shade, hardwood shade, so it kind of funnels down so it stays a little damper right there, even though it is more out in the pasture. And it's finally this year is really the year where it's like, now we're bushing out and now we're all flowering, so it'll continue to spread.
So as I'm assuming you're an herbalist, as an herbalist, if you're gonna harvest nettles, what would the peak time?
So primarily we're talking about use of leaf, and stem has similar compounds. There is some application for the root, mainly as a diuretic, and there's some laboratory studies done in rats relating to the possibility of it also helping with regulating blood sugar. So there again, the root isn't commonly used though, but there again, it's about the time of year. So if you did want to use the root, then you'd be getting it, in
But
that
for
time frame.
the leaves,
For the leaf,
when would you harvest?
if you want to eat it
Spring?
as a food herb, you would get it in the spring. You want to get it before flower, anytime before flower. Around here, like mine just started flowering towards the tail end of June. So anytime prior to June, I would have been, put it in a soup, saute it, put it in a quiche, whatever. Once it flowers, some compounds within the plant elevate that can be aggravating to the kidneys. So you don't want to really consume the fresh plant at that point. However, if you dry it down, it would still be okay to use as like a tea or a tincture at that point, post-flower. But that's just kind of the err on the side of caution thing, especially when it comes to like what's sold pre-made on the shelves. They don't tell you when they harvested it. One would hope that if it's a company that's formulated by a good herbalist that they would have known the right point to pick it. But like I was trying to have my mother-in-law use nettle for allergies. That's probably one of its biggest claims to fame is its histamine regulating benefit. But she was concerned about it affecting her kidneys that are already affected by her lupus, so she was just like, I'm just not gonna go there. But right application, right? I told her, well, yeah, you don't want to use the pre-made product because we don't know when they picked it, but we could just make tea with what's on the property and it'd be fine.
Does it have a strong magnesium content?
Pretty much all of your greens, you're looking at a robust mineral profile. The calcium and the iron were the things with it that were a little bit more off the charts, but there is magnesium, there's potassium. As your big four that usually show up. It might even have selenium. Yes, ma'am.
Have you heard of, I remember hearing that like with nettles when you make a tea, you wanna bring the water like right to a boil, but not too boiling. Something about it, like, I don't know if it's like to preserve nutrients, I can't remember now, it was a long time ago, but it like cracks the cell wall when it's at that point that you leave it overnight for like 8 hours.
Doing a longer infusion definitely has more usage from the herbal medicine side of things versus just casual cup of tea. For the most part, most teas you want to do that with the water. You don't want to boil it to high head because you just bring it to the boil and then you remove the kettle, and in that time it stops boiling before you pour it over the plant. So it's certainly, this isn't like, so usually the reason why like teas with the camellia plant, with your black and white and green teas, have a steep limit is because the tannins start to come out more and it can make it more bitter. I imagine most greens would potentially have that effect, but nettle, even cooking it down, it's a very mild herb. I mean, if you're going to use this as a pot herb compared to the mugwort, this will be like, oh yeah, there's some mugwort in there. This will be like, what is that green thing? You won't notice it. And so I think if you were to want to steep it longer, just in hopes of pulling even more of the water-soluble compounds out, it wouldn't affect the flavor or hurt it or anything. So I think that'd be totally fine. The histamine balancing property, I want to circle back around to that. If you want to use it for allergies, in general, when you're thinking of herbal medicine, concentration is obviously everything. So eating it, you get X amount of constituents. Tea is really the weakest way to use a medicinal herb, and it doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. There's a time and a place. But if you're really wanting to, say, use it for something that's specific, like I really need to kick this allergic response, you're going to be drinking an awful lot of tea to reach a threshold where it's being useful. So a tincture would be better, or a concentrated capsule formula in the nettles case. If you want to use it for like seasonal allergy reactivity, you'd be ideally starting it a month or two ahead of when your allergies tend to kick in. If you have seasonal allergies, give it some time to build up the resistance in the system, and then continue it through the allergy season. But I have used it acutely as well, because I don't really have seasonal allergies, but I've had, I'm not hyper-reactive to poison ivy, but I am reactive to poison ivy. And so I've had incidences where I've had it and I was like, well, once it's in people or get confused, poison ivy isn't just a scratch and spread. It gets into the bloodstream, and the reason it can pop up in other places is because it's traveling through the body and it'll just come out. So to try to prevent further irritation, because if you're scratching, you're stirring up that redness that comes is drawing blood to the surface, it's encouraging blood circulation, you're circulating that stuff through your system. You don't want to scratch it, you want to control the itch. Most people be like, reach for a Benadryl. Not that you can't, but I have used nettle where I would like double or triple up the dose. If the bottle says take 1 pill, I'd take 2 pills. If it says do it once a day, I would do it like every 2 to 3 hours. Just for a couple of days, but it would be enough to be comfortable and manageable and keep the outbreak from getting anywhere. So using it as a sort of a natural Benadryl alternative, depending on the severity of what you were dealing with and reacting to. Another ecological point about it is that it is known as what's in permaculture sometimes called a dynamic accumulator. It's really good at taking up nutrients from the soil, and by doing so, it's part of the reason why it's such a nutritious plant. But from that standpoint too, as the leaves drop, or if you intentionally turn it back into the soil as a green manure, you are putting all those nutrients right back into your soil. So it's really good for the surrounding habitat and landscape too, because of how it's helping with regenerating the health of the soil. Historically too, at one point this was considered to be as important as flax and hemp for fiber. And I actually watched a video one time of a gentleman who spent probably literally painstaking hours hand processing the stalks of nettle because it peels down into little strings, and then they would spin it and they would make yarn with it, and then you could weave your clothes out of. And at that point, my mother-in-law was like, "Oh my gosh, talk about a hair shirt!" And I'm like, I think at that point it's not itchy anymore. But it's just interesting to know that, you know, if, hey, maybe we need another. You know, we're having trouble with cotton farms and the GMO and the overspraying, and you know, in addition to hemp, maybe we could see a revival of nettle as a textile. Cautions, we touched upon the kidney issues, it's the stinging, you know, use gloves. Another thing, and this goes for all plants, period, but especially your weeds, because of their affinity for growing in disturbed areas, often near roadsides or where people are spraying, etc. Be careful about choosing where you're harvesting your plants. If it's high foot traffic, if it's anywhere that oil and antifreeze and stuff could have spilled down into, if it's next to your neighbor who goes crazy with the Roundup every year, find another source to get your plants. And maybe try to educate your neighbors so that they don't get it. Any questions about nettle? Everybody seemed really key.
I just wanted to comment, I love the fact that you compared it to moringa, which is like the new trendy herb. And I think that it's great that you're saying, hey, like it has such a nutritional profile, like this is our country, our native version of a multivitamin or multivitamin, multimineral, and we don't need to buy like exotic moringa powder, you know?
It's like, oh, goji berries from high in the Himalayas.
Right.
Okay, yeah. We've got native wild blueberries. I mean, you know, it's different colors. Okay, there's some different phyto compounds, but like, don't just be sucked in. And there's nothing wrong with those plants too. It's just that we shouldn't just be googly-eyed because it's exotic from somewhere else when there could be something equally useful for us in our backyard. Not to mention there's the thought of like bioregionalism, and that we are adapted to where we are from. I don't know how many people in this room are native to North Carolina. I am. My parents are not. My parents never had allergies, and then they moved down here before I was born, and they've had allergies ever since. They displaced what their body had become used to growing up, and it's hard for the body to adapt. I mean, we're very adaptable, and nettle can help you adjust. But there's something to be said for trying to eat local, eat in season, not just because it's, you know, the nice thing to do for your neighborly farmer, but because it's supporting your body in tune with the elements of the region that you actually live within. Moving on to mullein, I had to hunt this down up the road from my house today because for some reason this is the first year that there is none of it on my property. I'm a little sad about that.
I've seen.
This is before the flowers opened. There wasn't one with the flowers open in reach of me wearing sandals. Very fluffy leaves. Pass it around, and even the stalk is a little bit fluffy. And you will see this everywhere. It's just starting to come into bloom right now. There's a number of mullein species. There's 5 that are naturalized to North America. So naturalized is a term where it's just kind of like we've generally accepted that it's a North American plant. But at some point in its history, it was not.
Long ago.
Yeah, it's like it might as well be
I
native
wonder when they
now.
brought it over. What?
There's a few different theories on the mullein. So there's the thought that the seed was in the ballast that were used to help the ships stay in balance on their long journey overseas, and they would just fill the ballast with dirt, and the seeds are in the dirt, and then oops, here it is in the New World. Or that the seeds could have hitched a ride on the canvas of the sails, but that's probably a little harder to believe, at least for that plant.
And
It's
some
not got
tea.
bark
I've
seeds.
heard some tea from Squirrel that came over with them. It's a bag of tea.
But interestingly, and this is documented, that the seeds of the mullein plant contain a chemical compound called rhodotone, I think I'm saying that right, and it is known to stun fish. So, in fact, to the point that like U.S. Fish and Wildlife are like, you cannot use this chemical compound. It's, it's like, you shouldn't be poaching. This is not a sanctioned practice if you're gonna go fishing. It's like a canned hunt. So you'll see like survivalist blogs be like, oh, keep that mullein seed in case you ever need to really easily catch some fish. And I don't know how substantiated it is, but clearly it's substantiated enough that Fish and Wildlife needed to stop people from doing it. And so there's the thought that maybe it was actually brought over intentionally by settlers because they were employing it in their food catching methods.
I'm curious how. Like,
Did you
you like
It's a
bombard them with
compound, it's a
seeds?
chemical that's in the seed, and so you throw it in the water,
Hmm.
and it stuns them.
And then you just throw your net in and.
Wow.
I wanna,
Supposedly.
don't quote me, but I think I heard, so I don't know how long mullen's been in North America, but I think that the leaves, because they're so soft, the Native Americans put them in the soles of their moccasins. I'm not sure.
Actually,
I've heard that.
I didn't really have food use things to talk about with
Yeah,
mullein
lambs.
because, as you can tell by the leaves, the texture is just, there's nothing about that that makes you really want to be like, oh boy, I'm gonna eat me some of that. So they found other ways to make use of it besides the medicinal. Yes, insoles to shoes. When it dries down, it basically just turns into a little fluff, so you can use it as a really good tinder fire starter. Yes, you've been reading your book, I see.
So,
Yeah, it had some, well, it was said to have power over witches and evil spirits, whether that's repelling them is a debatable, but.
it's used in herbal smoke blends too. The leaf.
Are there like plants that look a lot like it in this area? Because I think I was with my daughter and she was like, I don't think that's mullein mom. It looks
There's
like
some
it.
other yellow flowering plants that grow tall, but don't remotely, but I mean, its leaves are quite distinct. I mean, even before it sends up its stalk, there's nothing else that's to
Okay.
that fluffy degree.
Another question.
Fluffy.
So-